Lena Carter had spent most of her life learning how to stay unnoticed. It was not a talent she was proud of. It was something she had developed out of necessity. Growing up in a small, worn-out neighborhood on the edge of a city that never slowed down, Lena understood early that attention often came with consequences. The less people noticed her, the safer she felt. The quieter she remained, the easier it was to survive. Her life had never been extraordinary. It was simple, structured around routines that rarely changed. She worked long hours in a modest cafe, barely making enough to cover rent and basic needs. The apartment she lived in was small, almost suffocating at times, with thin walls that carried every sound from the outside world. Yet it was hers, and for Lena, that was enough. Or at least it had been. The shift in her life did not come from a decision. It came from circumstance, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. The cafe where she worked began attracting a different kind of customer, not the usual office workers or retired commuters, but men who carried themselves differently. They spoke less, observed more, and left behind an atmosphere that lingered long after they were gone. Lena noticed it immediately. She always noticed things. They were not loud or aggressive. In fact, they were controlled, too controlled. Their presence changed the energy of the room without any visible effort. Conversations lowered. Movements became cautious. Even the air felt heavier when they were around. Lena never interacted with them directly at first. She kept her distance, focusing on her work, avoiding unnecessary eye contact. But avoidance, she would soon learn, did not guarantee invisibility. One evening, as the city outside dimmed into soft evening light, Lena found herself staying later than usual. A co-worker had called in sick, leaving her to manage the closing shift alone. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a single table occupied by one of those men. He had been there for hours, not drinking much, not eating much, just sitting, watching. Lena felt his presence without needing to look directly at him. It was a kind of awareness she had developed over years, the ability to sense when she was being observed. She continued her work, cleaning tables, organizing the counter, pretending not to notice. But something felt different that night. The quiet was too complete. When she finally allowed herself a glance in his direction, she noticed something unsettling. He wasn't watching the room. He was watching her, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but deliberately, carefully, as if studying her movements, her habits, her reactions. Lena quickly looked away, her pulse tightening slightly, though her expression remained unchanged. Moments later, the man stood up. He didn't approach her. He didn't say anything. He simply placed money on the table and walked out. But as he passed the counter, he slowed, just slightly, enough for Lena to feel it, enough for her to understand something had shifted. The next day, everything changed. The cafe owner, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in anything beyond daily operations, approached Lena with an unusual offer. His tone was different, careful, measured. There was a job opportunity, better pay, better environment, higher-level clientele, a private hospitality position. Lena didn't immediately respond. Offers like this didn't appear without reason, and in her world, unexpected opportunities often came with hidden costs. Still, she listened. The job required discretion, professionalism, adaptability, and silence. That last requirement stayed with her. Silence. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition. Lena understood what that meant without needing further explanation. This was not just a job. This was entry into something structured, controlled, and far more powerful than anything she had known. She should have refused. Every instinct she had developed over the years told her to stay away from anything that felt too precise, too deliberate. But reality had its own pressure. Rent was increasing. Expenses were rising. Stability was slipping. And this opportunity offered control, or at least the illusion of it. Lena accepted. The location she was given did not resemble a typical workplace. It was a high-end establishment, positioned in one of the most controlled areas of the city. From the outside, it appeared elegant, almost ordinary. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The difference. Everything was too perfect, too quiet, too structured. Employees move with precision, their expressions neutral, their actions calculated. There were no unnecessary conversations, no wasted movement. Every detail felt intentional. This was not just a business. This was a system. Lena adjusted quickly. She observed the routines, memorized the patterns, and adapted her behavior to match the environment. Her natural ability to remain unnoticed worked in her favor. She blended into the structure without disruption. But even within that control, there was something else, something beneath the surface, a presence that did not need to be announced. She became aware of it before she ever saw him. The atmosphere shifted when he was near. Conversations didn't stop, but they changed. Movements didn't pause, but they became sharper. It was subtle, so subtle that most people wouldn't notice. But Lena did, because she always noticed. The first time she saw Adrian Volkov, she understood immediately why his name carried weight. He did not look like chaos. He looked like control. There was nothing loud about him, no visible aggression, no unnecessary display of authority. Instead, there was something far more dangerous. Precision. He moved through the space like everything already belonged to him. Not just the building, but the people inside it. His posture was relaxed, his expression calm, his presence undeniable. People didn't react to him out of fear alone. They reacted because they understood his power. Lena kept her distance, focusing on her work, maintaining the same quiet composure she always had. But then, something unexpected happened. As Adrian passed through the room, his gaze shifted, not across the room, not toward the environment, toward her. It was brief, controlled, but intentional. And in that moment, Lena felt something she had spent years avoiding. Attention. She lowered her gaze immediately, adjusting her movements, minimizing her presence. But the damage, she realized, had already been done, because men like Adrian Volkov did not look without reason. The following days did not return to normal. If anything, they became more precise. Lena noticed the rules more clearly now, the boundaries, the unspoken expectations. There were areas she was not allowed to enter, conversations she was not meant to hear, decisions that happened beyond her reach. And yet, despite all of that, she began to feel something else. Curiosity, not reckless curiosity, not careless interest, controlled curiosity. Because Adrian Volkov did not behave the way she expected. Men with power often demanded attention. He did not. Men with control often imposed fear. He did not rely on it. Instead, he observed. That was what unsettled her the most. He noticed things, small details, subtle shifts, changes in behavior. And Lena was no exception. She became more careful. Every movement measured, every action intentional. Because now she understood something clearly. She was not just part of the environment anymore. She was part of his awareness. The realization settled slowly but deeply. And with it came tension. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. It followed her through her shifts, through her routines, through every quiet moment where she felt his presence somewhere in the same space. Watching, not in a way that could be proven, but in a way that could be felt. One evening, that tension finally shifted into something undeniable. Lena had been assigned to a more restricted section of the establishment. It was not an area she had worked in before. The instructions were clear, precise, no mistakes. She followed them exactly, because in a place like this, mistakes were not tolerated. As she moved through the space, carrying out her responsibilities with controlled precision, she became aware of something immediately. The room was quieter than usual, not empty, but focused, and at the center of that focus was him, Adrian Volkov. He stood near the far end of the room, engaged in something that did not require attention, yet commanded it completely. His posture remained relaxed, but his awareness was active. Lena adjusted her path slightly, ensuring she maintained distance. But as she moved, his attention shifted. Again, this time, there was no doubt he was watching her. Not briefly, not accidentally, deliberately. Lena continued her task, her movement steady, her expression unchanged. But inside, something shifted, because now there was no uncertainty left. This was not coincidence. This was not random. This was intentional. And intentional attention from a man like Adrian Volkov was dangerous. The room continued as if nothing had changed. But for Lena, everything had, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. In a world built on control, power, and precision, being noticed was not an advantage. It was a risk, a serious one. And as she finished her task and moved to leave the room, she felt his gaze follow her. Unbroken, unavoidable, final. That was the moment Lena Carter realized something she could no longer ignore. She had not just entered a dangerous world. She had stepped directly into the attention of the most dangerous man in it. And in that world, one wrong move would cost her everything. Lena Carter did not make the mistake of thinking she understood Adrian Volkov after their first few encounters. If anything, the more she observed, the more difficult he became to define. The realization came slowly, built through patterns rather than moments. Adrian did not simply operate within the city. He shaped it. His presence extended far beyond the walls of the establishment where Lena worked. It existed in structures, in decisions, in movements that most people never even noticed. And that was what made him dangerous. Not because he controlled everything visibly, but because he controlled it invisibly. The transition from curiosity to understanding began when Lena was assigned tasks that extended beyond the surface level of her role. At first, they seemed insignificant, small adjustments in scheduling, specific instructions about who to serve, where to stand, when to move. But over time, a pattern formed. Every instruction connected to something larger. Every detail aligned with a system that functioned without disruption. Adrian Volkov's empire was not built on chaos. It was built on discipline. Lena began to notice how different parts of the operation interacted. The hospitality business was only one layer. Behind it existed networks that extended into finance, logistics, security, and influence that reached far into the city's core. Nothing existed independently. Everything answered to something, and at the center of it all was him. Adrian did not attend every meeting. He did not involve himself in every decision. But when he did, the outcome was final. There were no arguments, no hesitation, no second chances. People did not question him. They adjusted to him. That was the first clear sign of his reputation. It wasn't built on fear alone. It was built on certainty. Lena witnessed it during a control meeting that she was never meant to fully understand. She had been placed in the room under the pretense of routine service, but the environment itself told a different story. The men present were not ordinary clients. They carried authority, influence, power of their own. And yet, when Adrian entered the room, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The conversation paused, not completely, but just enough to acknowledge his presence. The men adjusted their posture, their tone, their attention, because control had just entered the room. Lena remained in the background, her movements precise, her attention divided between her responsibilities and her observations. Adrian spoke briefly, not long, not unnecessarily. But when he did, the entire direction of the discussion changed. Decisions were made faster, arguments dissolved, outcomes aligned, and within minutes, everything was settled. No raised voices, no conflict, just resolution. That was when Lena understood something critical. Adrian Volkov didn't need to prove power. He defined it. The realization stayed with her as she continued moving deeper into her role, because the more she saw, the more one truth became unavoidable. He did not just control operations. He controlled outcomes. People did not act freely around him. They acted predictably, because he created an environment where unpredictability did not survive. That level of control required something beyond intelligence. It required discipline. And Adrian's discipline was absolute. Lena noticed it in the smallest details. His schedule never shifted without reason. His presence never appeared without purpose. His behavior never revealed more than necessary. There were no wasted movements, no careless actions. Even his silence felt intentional. And perhaps most importantly, he trusted no one. Not fully, not completely. That became clear over time. There were individuals who worked closely with him, who held positions of importance, who appeared loyal. But trust, true trust, did not exist in his world. Only usefulness. And usefulness could change at any moment. Lena saw the consequences of that reality during an internal incident that was handled with quiet efficiency. A mistake had been made, not large enough to disrupt operations, but significant enough to matter. The man responsible was not confronted publicly. There was no scene, no visible punishment. He simply disappeared, and no one asked questions, because in Adrian Volkov's world, questions were unnecessary. Outcomes spoke for themselves. That was the moment Lena felt something shift inside her. Not fear. She had learned to manage that. Something else. Awareness. Because now she understood the full extent of the environment she had entered. This was not just a dangerous world. This was a controlled one. And in controlled systems, there was no space for error. Yet despite all of this, despite the discipline, the structure, the quiet severity of his empire, there was one detail that did not fit. Her. Lena Carter did not belong in this world. Not naturally, not by design. And yet, she remained, not only present, but increasingly closer. That was what unsettled her, because proximity to Adrian Volkov was not accidental. It was intentional, and intention always carried meaning. She began to notice it more clearly in the following days. Subtle shifts in her assignments, small changes in positioning, moments where she found herself placed in closer range of him without explanation. At first, she assumed it was coincidence, then routine, but over time, that assumption faded, because patterns did not lie, and the pattern was clear. Adrian was aware of her, more than aware, focused, not constantly, not openly, but deliberately. Lena felt it in the way his attention would settle briefly on her before moving on, in the way her presence seemed to align with his movements more often than it should, in the way others began to notice her position, even if they didn't understand it. That attention created something new. Tension, not external, internal, because now she wasn't just navigating a controlled environment. She was navigating his attention, and that was far more dangerous. The shift became undeniable during an evening gathering that carried more weight than the others. The room was filled with individuals who held power of their own. Conversations were quieter, more strategic. Movements were calculated. Lena had been assigned a position closer to the center of the room, closer than usual, closer than necessary. She maintained her composure, focusing on her role, controlling every movement, but her awareness remained sharp because she could feel it. His presence, not distant, not indirect, close. Adrian stood across the room, engaged in a conversation that required his full attention, and yet, at intervals, his gaze shifted toward her, not long, not obvious, but enough for her to feel it, enough for her to understand something was changing. Lena continued her work without reacting, because reaction would expose everything, and exposure was not an option. But something else began to surface. Not fear, not curiosity, something more complex. Pressure, because being noticed by a man like Adrian Volkov did not come without consequences. And those consequences were not always visible at first. She saw the first sign of it in others. The way certain individuals began to observe her more closely. The way conversations shifted slightly when she entered a space. The way her presence, though still quiet, was no longer invisible. That was when another layer revealed itself. Jealousy, not open, not spoken, but present, because proximity to power always created tension. And Lena had gained proximity, whether she wanted it or not. One particular moment made that reality impossible to ignore. An interaction that should have remained routine did not. A man within the inner structure, someone who had held his position for years, made a small but noticeable error in addressing her. Not disrespectful, but dismissive, the kind of behavior that would normally go unnoticed. Except this time, it didn't. Adrian's response was immediate, not loud, not aggressive, but precise. A single correction, delivered calmly, but with enough weight to change everything. The man adjusted instantly. The mistake was not repeated, and the message was clear. Lena's position was not to be overlooked. That moment created a ripple, not visible to outsiders, but undeniable within the structure, because now her presence had been acknowledged, not by words, but by action. And in Adrian Volkov's world, action defined reality. Lena felt the impact of that shift immediately, because now she was no longer just part of the environment. She was part of the structure, and structures like this did not include people without reason. The question was no longer whether Adrian noticed her. The question was, why? That question stayed with her, growing, expanding, becoming more difficult to ignore, because every day that passed, the pattern continued. She was placed closer, given more access, allowed to remain within his range of awareness, not constantly, not obviously, but consistently. And consistency was never accidental. Lena tried to maintain distance, not physically. That was no longer possible, but mentally, emotionally, because understanding him too closely would complicate everything, and complication was dangerous. But the more she observed, the more difficult that distance became, because Adrian Volkov was not just power. He was control, and control, when understood properly, was difficult to ignore. That was the moment everything shifted again, not through action, but through realization, because Lena Carter understood something she had been avoiding. Adrian Volkov did not just control the city. He controlled people, their behavior, their decisions, their outcomes. And now he was beginning to control her position within his world, not forcefully, not obviously, but deliberately. That realization settled heavily, because it meant one thing. She was no longer navigating his world on her own. She was being positioned within it, and positioning always led somewhere. The question was, where and why? As Lena stood within the controlled silence of another carefully structured evening, she felt his presence shift again, closer, more direct, more intentional than before. And in that moment, one truth became impossible to ignore. Adrian Volkov was no longer simply aware of her. He was keeping her close, closer than necessary, closer than safe. And that choice raised a question Lena Carter could not answer. Was she being protected or controlled? Lena Carter had already begun to understand one truth about Adrian Volkov's world. Nothing small stayed small for long. Every action carried weight. Every detail had the potential to shift something larger beneath the surface. And yet, despite that awareness, there were still moments that felt ordinary enough to ignore, moments that appeared harmless, moments that did not feel like decisions, until they became consequences. The shift began on a day that did not seem important. The city was colder than usual, not harsh enough to stop movement, but sharp enough to be felt in every exposed space. The wind moved through the streets with quiet persistence, carrying a chill that lingered longer than expected. Lena noticed at the moment she stepped outside the building. Her schedule had changed again, another subtle adjustment that placed her in a different part of the structure, one that required occasional movement beyond the main interior. It wasn't unusual anymore. By this point, she had learned not to question the shifts, but this time, the environment itself felt different, less controlled, less contained, and for a brief moment, almost normal. That was where Ethan Cole entered her world. He did not belong to the inner structure the way others did. His presence was different, less rigid, less calculated. He moved with a kind of quiet ease that stood in contrast to everything Lena had grown used to. Ethan worked within one of the operational extensions tied to Adrian's network, not at the center, not in positions of visible power, but close enough to be trusted and distant enough to remain unnoticed by most. Lena noticed him because he didn't fit the pattern, and people who didn't fit patterns stood out. Their first interaction was not significant. At least, it didn't seem that way. A simple moment, a practical one. Lena had stepped outside briefly to complete a task that required coordination with external logistics. The cold air hit her immediately, sharper than expected. cutting through the thin layers she wore. She didn't react outwardly. She rarely did. But Ethan noticed, not in the way others notice things within Adrian's world. Calculated, observant, measured. His attention was simpler, more human, without asking questions, without creating a situation. He removed his jacket and handed it to her. No hesitation, no expectation, just a quiet, practical solution to an obvious problem. Lena paused for a fraction of a second, because gestures like that did not exist in Adrian Volkov's world. Not freely, not without purpose. But this felt different. There was no weight behind it, no hidden meaning, just warmth. Lena accepted it, not because she needed it, but because refusing it would have created unnecessary attention. The jacket was heavier than she expected, warm, comfortable, and for a brief moment, it softened something inside her, not dramatically, not noticeably, but enough, because for the first time since entering this world, something felt normal. That was a mistake, because normal did not belong here. The moment passed quickly. Lena completed her task, returned inside, and continued her responsibilities without disruption. The jacket remained around her shoulders longer than intended, not as a statement, not as a decision, just oversight, a small detail, one that should not have mattered. But in a world where everything was observed, nothing remained unnoticed. Adrian Volkov did not need to be present to be aware, but this time, he was. The moment he entered the space, the environment responded the way it always did. Subtle adjustments, controlled movements, unspoken acknowledgement of power. Lena felt it immediately, that shift, that presence. But she did not look at him, because by now, she understood the risk of doing so. She continued her work, her posture steady, her movements precise, unaware that she had already made a mistake. Adrian's attention did not move randomly. It never did. When his gaze shifted, it landed with purpose. And this time, it landed on her. Not briefly, not casually, deliberately. The jacket stood out immediately. Not because it was unusual, but because it did not belong. Not to her, not to this space, and certainly not to him. Adrian's expression did not change. Not visibly, but something beneath the surface shifted. Something controlled, something contained, something dangerous. Because in a world he controlled completely, there was one thing he did not tolerate: unclaimed variables. And at that moment, Lena Carter became one. The realization did not come to her immediately, because outwardly, nothing changed. Adrian continued moving through the space with the same precision. His posture remained relaxed, his behavior unchanged. To anyone else, there was no difference, but control, when disrupted, did not always show itself immediately. Sometimes it waited, and that was what made it more dangerous. Lena continued her responsibilities, unaware of the shift she had caused. The jacket remained around her shoulders, its presence now carrying a weight she could not feel yet, but others could. The room responded, subtly, quietly. Attention shifted, not openly, but noticeably, because everyone within that world understood something instinctively. Adrian Volkov noticed everything, and when he noticed something, it mattered. Ethan, standing at a distance, did not immediately recognize the impact of a simple gesture. To him, it had been nothing more than a moment of basic decency. But Evie felt the shift, the change in atmosphere, the tightening of something unseen, because Adrian's presence was not passive. It influenced everything. The next few minutes passed without interruption. No confrontation, no reaction, just continuation. And yet, the tension grew, not outwardly, internally, within the structure, within the people, within the control Adrian maintained so carefully, because something had been introduced into his world that he had not placed there. That alone was enough. Lena finally became aware of it when she felt his presence closer than expected, not across the room, not distant, near. Her movement slowed slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to register the shift. She turned, just enough to acknowledge his presence, And for the first time since the moment began, their eyes met. The impact was immediate, not because of what he showed, but because of what he didn't. There was no anger in his expression, no visible reaction, just stillness, controlled, measured, unreadable. But beneath that stillness, something existed, something she could not fully understand, but could feel. Intensity, not loud, not chaotic, focused, sharp, and directed entirely at her. Lena held his gaze for only a second before looking away, because instinct told her to, because something about that moment felt wrong, not dangerous in an obvious way, dangerous in a way that had not yet revealed itself. Adrian did not speak. He did not approach further. He simply observed. And then he moved on, as if nothing had happened, as if everything remained the same. But it didn't. The shift had already occurred. Lena felt it in the way the environment tightened around her, in the way people adjusted their behavior, subtly when she moved, in the way her position within the space felt different, more exposed, more defined. The jacket suddenly felt heavier, not physically, symbolically, because now it was no longer just an object. It was a signal, one she had not intended to send, but had, and Adrian Volkov had received it. Ethan approached her later, unaware of the full impact, his expression unchanged, his demeanor still calm. Lena removed the jacket and returned it without comment, because something inside her had already shifted. An instinct, a warning, a recognition that something small had just become something significant. Ethan accepted it, unaware of the line that had just been crossed, because he did not belong to the center. He did not understand the weight of Adrian's attention, but Lena was beginning to. The rest of the day passed without incident. No confrontation, no consequences, no visible reaction. Everything returned to structure, to control, to normal. But Lena understood something now. Normal did not exist here, only delayed reactions. And delayed reactions were often the most dangerous because they gave illusion of safety. Before everything changed, as the evening settled and the environment quieted into its usual controlled rhythm, Lena felt his presence again, not distant, not indirect, closer, more consistent, more intentional than before. She did not look, she did not react, but she knew, because awareness had become instinct. Adrian Volkov was no longer simply observing her. He was focused on her, and focus, in his world, always led to action. The question was not if, the question was when. And as Lena continued moving through the controlled silence of his empire, one truth settled deeply within her mind. Something had changed, something she could not undo, and something she did not yet fully understand, because what seemed like a simple moment, a harmless gesture, a borrowed jacket, had done something far more dangerous than she realized. It had triggered something in Adrian Volkov that did not belong to control. It belonged to possession. And possession, when challenged, did not remain quiet. It responded, decisively. And as the silence of the evening deepened, Adrian's calm exterior revealed nothing. But beneath that calm, a storm had already begun to form, one that would not stay contained for long. The shift did not arrive with noise. It did not come with raised voices, shattered objects, or visible chaos. In Adrian Volkov's world, loss of control did not look like disorder. It looked like silence, a deeper kind of silence, one that carried weight, one that made people adjust without being told, one that made the air itself feel tighter. Lena Carter felt it the moment she stepped into the building the following day. Nothing appeared different at first glance. The structure remained intact. The routines continued, the same control movements, the same quiet discipline. But something underneath had changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. The atmosphere felt sharper, as if every person inside the space had become more aware of their own actions. Movements were more precise. Conversations were shorter. Even the smallest interactions carried an unspoken tension. Lena didn't need confirmation. She understood immediately. Something had happened, or rather, something had begun. The memory of the previous days surfaced in her mind with quiet clarity. The jacket, the moment Adrian had seen it, the way his expression had not changed, and yet everything beneath it had. At the time, she had not fully understood what it meant. Now, she was beginning to, because in a world built on control, disruptions did not pass unnoticed. They were addressed, corrected, eliminated. Lena continued her work carefully, her movements more controlled than usual. She avoided unnecessary attention, minimized her presence, and followed every instruction with precision. But avoidance did not erase awareness. She felt it, his presence, not physically close yet, but present, active, watching. And that awareness alone was enough to unsettle her. The first clear sign of what was coming did not involve her directly. It involved Ethan, or rather, his absence. Lena noticed it immediately, not because she was searching for him, but because people in this world did not simply disappear without reason. And Ethan Cole had disappeared. There were no announcements, no explanations, no visible reaction from others. But the absence itself spoke loudly. Lena's movement slowed for a brief moment as the realization settled, because now the connection was impossible to ignore. The jacket, the attention, the shift, and now this. Her pulse remained steady, but her thoughts shifted rapidly, because she understood something clearly now. This was not coincidence. This was consequence. She did not ask questions, because questions were not welcomed here, but her awareness sharpened. Every detail mattered now, every movement, every glance, every silence, because the situation had moved beyond uncertainty. It had become real. The confrontation did not happen the way she expected. There was no direct accusation, no moment where Adrian approached her with visible anger or demanded explanation. Instead, it unfolded differently, more controlled, more precise, more dangerous. Lena was called to a restricted section of the building later that evening. The instruction was simple, but the meaning behind it was not. She followed without hesitation, because hesitation would create attention, and attention was already a risk. The space she entered was quieter than the rest of the building, more isolated, more controlled. It was not a place for routine tasks. It was a place for decisions. Adrian was already there, standing near the far end of the room, still, composed, unmoving. His presence filled the space without effort. Lena stopped at a respectful distance, her posture steady, her expression controlled. She did not speak, because this was not a conversation. This was something else, something heavier. The silence stretched, not empty, deliberate. Adrian did not look at her immediately. His attention remained fixed on something unseen, as if allowing a moment to settle before acknowledging her presence. That alone was enough to increase the tension, because delay, in his world, was intentional. Finally, he turned. His gaze settled on her, and in that moment, Lena understood something she had not fully grasped before. This was not anger, not in the way she expected. It was control, pushed to its limit. His expression remained calm, unchanged, but his eyes held something sharper, something colder, something that did not need to be spoken, because it was already understood. Lena held her composure, meeting his gaze only briefly before lowering it slightly, not out of submission, out of instinct, because something in that moment demanded it. Adrian took a step forward, not aggressively, not quickly, but deliberately. Every movement measured, every step controlled, and with each step, the tension increased, because this was not a reaction. This was a decision. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to command presence, far enough to maintain distance. Balance, always balance. Lena remained still, because movement now would disrupt the structure of the moment, and disruption was not safe. Adrian's gaze did not leave her, not for a second, and in that silence, something became clear. This was not about the jacket, not entirely. It was about what it represented, a variable, something outside his control, something he had not placed, something that did not belong to him, and that was unacceptable. Lena felt the realization settle slowly, because now she understood the true nature of the situation. This was not about rules, or structure, or discipline. This was about possession, not spoken, not declared, but present. And that presence was dangerous. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because control did not require volume. It required certainty, and his certainty was absolute. The silence between them shifted again, not easing, tightening, because something had changed, something irreversible. Lena felt in the way the space seemed smaller, in the way her awareness sharpened to every detail, in the way her own breathing felt more controlled than before, because now she was no longer observing his world. She was inside his focus, completely. The consequences of Ethan's involvement did not need to be explained. They were already understood. His absence was enough, and that absence carried weight, because it meant one thing. Adrian Volkov did not tolerate interference, not even accidental, not even harmless. Lena felt a quiet tension build inside her, not fear, something more complex, recognition, because she understood now she had triggered something, not intentionally, not knowingly, but undeniably, and once triggered, it could not be undone. Adrian's gaze remained steady, unmoving, and in that moment, he made something clear, not through words, through presence, through control, through silence. Lena Carter was no longer just part of his world. She was part of his attention, and attention, in his world, was ownership. The realization settled deeply, because ownership did not come with freedom. It came with limits, with expectations, with consequences. Lena's thoughts shifted rapidly, because this changed everything. Her position, her safety, her future within this space. Because now there was no distance left, no neutrality, no invisibility. She had crossed into something else, something far more dangerous, and there was no way back. Adrian stepped closer again, just slightly, enough to close the distance further, enough to remove any remaining space between awareness and reality. Lena did not move, because movement would break the moment, and breaking the moment would make things worse. The tension reached its peak, not explosive, not chaotic, contained, but heavy, because this was what control looked like when it was pushed beyond its limit. It did not shatter. It tightened until everything else adjusted around it. And Lena was now at the center of that adjustment. Adrian finally shifted his gaze slightly, not away from her, but enough to signal something. A decision made, final, irreversible. The moment ended the same way it began, in silence. But this silence was different, because now it carried meaning. Lena stepped back slightly, her movements controlled, her expression unchanged. But inside, everything had shifted, because she understood something now with absolute clarity. Adrian Volkov did not lose control the way other men did. He did not react impulsively. He did not act emotionally. He absorbed. He calculated. And then he acted decisively, and the consequences were already in motion. As Lena left the room, the weight of that realization followed her, because now there was no uncertainty left, no confusion, no doubt, only truth. She had triggered something in Adrian Volkov, something deeper than control, something more dangerous than power. And as she moved through controlled silence of his world, one final realization settled in her mind. Adrian Volkov did not just want order. He did not just want obedience. He did not just want control. He wanted something far more dangerous. He wanted her. After that night, nothing returned the way it had been before. Lena Carter understood that immediately. The silence Adrian Volkov had left behind in that room did not fade with time. It followed her. It reshaped the way she moved, the way she thought, and most importantly, the way she was seen inside his world, because now she was no longer invisible. And in a world like his, visibility came with consequences. The first change was not obvious. It did not come through rules or direct orders. There were no spoken restrictions placed on her, no visible limits enforced. Instead, it came through something far more subtle. Attention. Adrian's attention was no longer distant. It was constant, not in a way that felt overwhelming at first, but in a way that felt deliberate, calculated, controlled. Lena began to notice how her movements aligned with his presence more frequently than before. Not coincidence, not routine, design. Her assignments changed again, this time placing her in environments where Adrian operated more closely. She was no longer positioned on the outer edges of his world. She was placed within it, not fully, but enough to feel the shift. And that shift carried something she could not ignore. Protection. At first, she didn't recognize it for what it was. It appeared as structure, as careful positioning, as quiet adjustments that ensured her presence remained within controlled spaces. But over time, the pattern became clear. She was being watched, not by everyone, by him, and not just watched, managed. That realization unsettled her more than anything else, because control in Adrian's world was expected. But this was different. This was personal. Lena saw it in the way others interacted with her now, the subtle shift in behavior, the careful distance people maintained, the quiet awareness that followed her presence in rooms she had once passed through unnoticed. No one said anything. They didn't need to, because everyone understood something she was still trying to process. She had become important, and importance, in Adrian Volkov's world, was dangerous. The deeper change came in the way Adrian himself behaved, not outwardly, not in ways others could easily detect, but in moments, small ones, measured ones, moments where his attention lingered longer than necessary, moments where his presence aligned too precisely with hers, moments where silence carried more meaning than words ever could. Lena tried to maintain distance, not physically. That was no longer entirely within her control, but emotionally, mentally, because understanding him, getting too close to what he was, would complicate everything, and complication was not something she could afford. But the more she observed, the more that distance became difficult, because Adrian Volkov was no longer just a force of control in her life. He was becoming something else, something harder to define, something more dangerous, predictable, not in his actions, in his focus, because his attention always returned to her, and attention, repeated enough times, became intention. That was when Lena understood the truth she had been avoiding. This was not anger, not anymore. Anger passed, anger reacted, anger ended. But this remained, this evolved, this adapted, this was obsession. The realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, heavily, like something that had always been there, but had only now become visible. Adrian did not treat her like others. That much was undeniable. But it was not softness. It was not kindness. It was something far more controlled. He removed obstacles from her path. Quietly, efficiently, without explanation. People who created unnecessary friction around her. Stopped, not corrected, not warned. Stopped. And in a world like his, that meant only one thing. Eliminated. Lena noticed it in patterns, in absences, in the way certain tensions disappeared before they could fully form. At first, she tried not to connect it, but eventually, she couldn't ignore it, because the pattern always led back to her. That realization created something new inside her. Conflict, not fear, not entirely. Something more complex. Because while part of her recognized the danger, another part recognized something else. Security. And that was what made it worse. Because safety, within control, was not freedom. It was dependency. Lena began to feel it in her own behavior. The way she adjusted her movements not just to avoid attention, but to remain within his awareness. The way her instincts shifted, not to escape his world, but to understand it better. The way her thoughts started including him, without intention, without permission. That was when she understood the true danger. This was not one-sided, not entirely, because something inside her was responding, and that response was not safe, The emotional tension between them deepened without a single direct confrontation. It existed in silence, in proximity, in the space between what was said and what was understood. Lena found herself more aware of him than she wanted to be, not just his presence, his patterns, the way he moved, the way he observed, the way he controlled everything around him, except one thing, her. And that lack of control was what made his attention stronger, sharper, more focused, because Adrian Volkov did not accept uncertainty. He eliminated it, but Lena remained uncertain, and that made her unavoidable. There were moments where their paths crossed more directly now, not arranged, not announced, but inevitable. In those moments, the tension became something almost tangible, not aggressive, not explosive, but heavy, filled with something neither of them acknowledged, because acknowledgement would make it real, and reality would change everything. Lena felt it most in the quiet moments, the ones where nothing happened, where no one spoke, where no action was taken, and yet everything shifted, because those were the moments where awareness became connection, and connection, in a world built on control, was dangerous. Adrian did not loosen his grip on anything in his world. That was clear, but when it came to Lena, his control took a different form. It wasn't restrictive. It was encompassing. She was not confined, but she was contained, within his reach, within his awareness, within his system. And systems like his did not release what they absorbed. That realization settled deeper with each passing day, because Lena began to see the truth in a way she hadn't before. She was no longer navigating his world. She was part of it, integrated, positioned, and slowly trapped, not physically, not yet, but psychologically, because leaving was no longer simple. It wasn't just about walking away. It was about what she would be walking away from: control, protection, power, and something far more dangerous. Him. That was the moment everything became clear. Not just about Adrian, but about herself. Because fear alone did not keep her there. If it did, she would have left, found a way, taken the risk. But she didn't. And that meant one thing. There was something else holding her in place. Something she had not expected. Something she did not want to admit. Something that mirrored his obsession, in a quieter, more controlled way. Attachment, not fully formed, not fully understood, but present and growing. That realization unsettled her more than anything else, because control from him was expected. But losing control of herself was not. The balance between power and emotion began to shift, subtly, dangerously, because Adrian's control was absolute, but his focus was not. And Lena's fear was real, but her resistance was weakening. That combination was unstable, and unstable systems did not last. They broke, or they transformed. There was no middle ground. As Lena stood within the quiet structure of his world, feeling the weight of everything that had changed, one final realization settled in her mind. Leaving Adrian Volkov was no longer just a choice. It was a risk, a serious one, because men like him did not lose control. They redirected it. And once something became part of his world, it did not simply walk away. It was either kept or removed. And as Lena Carter looked ahead, understanding the depth of what she'd become involved in, one truth became impossible to ignore. Staying with him was dangerous, but leaving him might be worse. The realization that leaving Adrian Volkov might be more dangerous than staying did not leave Lena Carter's mind. It settled there, quietly, heavily, like something that refused to be ignored. Because for the first time since entering his world, Lena was no longer just reacting to what she saw. She was beginning to ask why. Why did a man with absolute control react so strongly to something as small as a borrowed jacket? Why did his attention feel less like authority and more like something personal? Why did his presence carry not just power, but restraint? The answers did not come easily, because Adrian Volkov was not a man who explained himself. His past was not discussed, not openly, not casually, and certainly not with someone like her. but in a world built on patterns. Truth did not stay hidden forever. It revealed itself in fragments, in behavior, in silence. Lena began to notice those fragments more clearly now, not because she was searching for them, but because her understanding had changed. And when understanding changed, perspective followed. The first indication came through something unexpected, not information. Absence. There were moments when Adrian disappeared from the structure entirely. Not for long. Not enough to disrupt operations, but enough to be noticed. And when he returned, something about him shifted, not visibly, but internally. His control became sharper, tighter, as if something had been tested and reinforced. Lena recognized that pattern, because control like his did not exist without reason. It was not natural. It was built, and things that were built had origins. That realization led her to observe more carefully, not just what he did, but what others did around him. Because in controlled systems, people revealed truths without meaning to, especially when they were careful, especially when they tried not to say too much. One evening, Lena found herself in a position she had not expected, not by request, not by instruction, but by proximity. A quiet conversation between two individuals within the inner structure, men who had been part of Adrian's world long before she entered it. Their voices were low, measured, but not silent enough, and Lena was close enough to hear. Not everything, just fragments. But fragments were enough. Wasn't always like this. After what happened, lost everything in one night. Lena's attention sharpened instantly, not visibly, but internally, because those words did not fit the image of Adrian Volkov she knew. Lost everything. That did not align with control. That aligned with something else. Loss. Real loss. The kind that changed people. The kind that did not fade. The kind that redefined everything that came after it. She did not move closer. She did not risk being noticed. But she listened carefully, because now this mattered. Trusted the wrong people. Family betrayal. That's why he doesn't. The sentence did not finish, but it did not need to, because Lena understood. Trust, that was a missing piece. The conversation ended quickly, as most conversations like that did, because in a world like this, speaking too much was dangerous. But the damage, or rather, the truth, had already been revealed. Lena stepped away quietly, her thoughts shifting rapidly, because now she had something she didn't have before. Context, and context changed everything. She began to see him differently after that. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, because once a truth was known, it could not be unseen. Adrian Volkov was not born into control. He built it, and people only build control like that after losing it completely. The idea settled into her mind with quiet force, because it explained things. His discipline, his precision, his inability to tolerate unpredictability, and most importantly, his reaction to her, because she was unpredictable, not by intention, but by nature. She had entered his world without structure, without placement, without design, and that made her a risk, but also something else, something he could not define. And what Adrian Volkov could not define, he controlled, or tried to. The deeper Lena thought about it, the clearer it became. This was not just about power. It was about prevention. He did not control everything because he wanted to dominate. He controlled everything because he had once lost control. And that loss had cost him everything. The emotional weight of that realization settled slowly, because for the first time, Lena did not just see him as dangerous. She saw him as human, and that was far more complicated, because understanding someone like Adrian Volkov created something unexpected. Sympathy, not fully formed, not overwhelming, but present. And that presence changed the way she saw him. She noticed it in his silence, in the moments where his control seemed heavier than necessary, in the way he watched the world around him, not just to command it, but to ensure it never slipped away again. That realization created conflict inside her, because sympathy, in a situation like this, was dangerous. It blurred lines, weakened distance, created connection, and connection was something she could not afford, not with him, not in his world. But the more she understood, the harder it became to maintain that distance. Because Adrian Volkov was not just controlling his environment, he was protecting himself from loss, from betrayal, from anything that resembled the past he had survived. And Lena, without meaning to, had stepped into that space. That realization hit harder than anything else, because now she understood her role in a way she hadn't before. She was not just someone he noticed, she was someone he could lose control over. And that was unacceptable to him. The emotional tension between them deepened again, but this time it was different, less sharp, more complex, because now there was understanding beneath it, not agreement, not acceptance, but awareness. And awareness changed everything. Lena found herself questioning things she had not questioned before. Not about him, about herself. Why had she stayed? Why had she not left when she still could? Why did his presence feel less like a threat and more like something she was trying to understand? The answers were not simple, because emotions rarely were, and this situation was anything but simple. She tried to maintain distance again, tried to return to the version of herself that observed without involvement, but it no longer worked, because once she saw the truth, she could not ignore it. Adrian Volkov was not just a man of control. He was a man shaped by loss, and that loss had turned into something permanent, something that defined everything he did, everything he allowed, everything he refused, and most importantly, everything he held on to. Lena realized something else then, something that unsettled her more than anything before. She was no longer just trying to survive his world. She was trying to understand him, and understanding him was pulling her deeper, because it replaced fear with something far more dangerous. Connection, not strong, not complete, but growing. And growth, in a place like this, never ended safely. As Lena stood in the quiet structure of his world, feeling the weight of everything she had learned, one final realization settled in her mind. Adrian Volkov was not just dangerous. He was broken, not in a way that made him weak, in a way that made him controlled, precise, unyielding, because broken things, when rebuilt, did not crack easily again. They hardened. And as Lena Carter looked at him from a distance, seeing him not just as power, but as something shaped by pain, she understood something she hadn't before. He wasn't just holding on to control. He was holding on to survival. And she had become part of that, which meant she was no longer just dealing with a dangerous man. She was dealing with a man who had nothing left to lose, except her. And that realization changed everything. The realization that Adrian Volkov had nothing left to lose except her did not bring Lena Carter comfort. It brought pressure, because being the only thing a man like him could lose was more dangerous than being his enemy. That truth followed her into every moment that came after. The distance she once tried to maintain no longer existed. Not physically, not emotionally, not even mentally. Everything between them had become too close, too real, too irreversible. And yet, the closer they became, the more fragile everything felt, because connection, in a world built on control, created weakness, and weakness invited attack. The first sign of that attack did not come as violence. It came as disruption, small at first, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Lena had learned how to see patterns, and this was a pattern breaking. Operations began to shift unpredictably. Information that was once secure felt delayed. Movements that followed strict timing began to show inconsistencies. Nothing large enough to cause panic, but enough to signal something dangerous. External pressure, rivals, enemies who had been waiting for the right moment. And now they had found it, because Adrian Volkov was no longer just controlling his empire. He was protecting something inside it. And that shift made him vulnerable. Lena noticed a change in him before anyone else. Not in his actions. Those remained precise, controlled, unshaken, but in his focus, it had narrowed, sharpened, not on the Empire, on her. He began positioning her differently, closer, more protected, more watched, not in a way that felt suffocating, but in a way that felt intentional, deliberate, calculated, as if he was anticipating something and preparing for it. That realization unsettled Lena more than anything else, because if Adrian Volkov was preparing, then the threat was real, and close, very close. The emotional tension between them deepened under that pressure, but it changed again, not into distance, into something stronger, something harder to define, because the line between fear and attachment had begun to blur. Lena found herself noticing things she once ignored. The way he adjusted his movements to stay within her proximity. The way his attention shifted instantly when something fell off. The way his presence, once overwhelming, had become grounding. That shift was dangerous, because it replaced fear with something far more complicated. Trust, not complete, not blind, but growing. And trust, in a world like this, was a risk. The emotional hook settled in her mind like a quiet warning. The most dangerous thing wasn't that Adrian could destroy her. It was that she might choose to stay even if he did. That thought stayed with her, because it forced her to confront something she had been avoiding. Her choice. She was no longer trapped. Not completely. There were still moments, small, rare moments, where she could leave, disappear, walk away before everything collapsed. But she didn't. And that decision said more than anything else. The external threats escalated quickly after that. What began as disruption turned into direct pressure. One of Adrian's outer operations was intercepted, not destroyed. Tested. A message. Clear. Controlled. Intentional. They weren't just attacking his power. They were studying it, looking for weakness. And Lena had become that weakness. Adrian understood that immediately, because men like him did not ignore patterns. They anticipated outcomes. And the outcome was clear. If his enemies wanted control, they would not attack him directly. They would attack what he protected. That realization changed everything. Security tightened around her. Movements restricted, not as punishment, as protection. But protection still felt like confinement. Lena felt it immediately. The shift from freedom to control, from movement to limitation. And for a moment, the old fear returned, sharp, familiar, because this was what she had feared from the beginning, being trapped, controlled, owned. But something had changed, because now she understood why, and understanding made it harder to resist. The emotional conflict inside her grew stronger. Fear told her to leave, to escape before she lost herself completely. But something else, something deeper, held her in place, because leaving Adrian Volkov no longer felt like safety. It felt like loss, and that realization terrified her more than anything else. The next escalation came without warning, a direct attempt, not on the Empire, on her. It happened in a moment that should have been safe, controlled, predictable. But enemies did not wait for predictable moments. They created their own. Lena felt it before she saw it, the shift in air, the disruption in pattern, and then movement, fast, precise, dangerous. The attack was not chaotic. It was calculated, targeted, focused entirely on one outcome. Her. She reacted instinctively, not trained, not prepared, but aware, because survival had become part of her now. Everything happened quickly, too quickly to process, too fast to think. Only reaction, only movement, only escape. But she didn't run. That was the moment everything changed, because instead of escaping, she moved toward him, toward Adrian, not away. That decision was not logical. It was not safe, but it was real, and real choices defined outcomes. Adrian responded instantly. The moment he saw the threat, everything shifted. The control, the calm, the precision, all remained, but something underneath broke through, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Ruthlessness, not the controlled version people feared, the raw version, the one built from loss, from protection, from a need to never lose again. The attack ended quickly, decisively, not because it failed, but because Adrian ended it, completely, without hesitation, without mercy, because when something threatened what he had chosen to protect, he did not negotiate. He removed it. The aftermath was silent, heavy, final. Lena stood there, her breath unsteady, her thoughts still catching up to what had just happened, because something had shifted again, not outside, inside her. She had not run. She had chosen him, without thinking, without hesitation. And that choice changed everything. Adrian turned toward her, his expression controlled, but his eyes different, not distant, not unreadable. Something else, something she had not seen before. Fear, not for himself, for her. That realization hit harder than anything else, because Adrian Volkov did not fear anything except loss, and she had become that possibility. The emotional closeness between them deepened in that moment, not through words, not through action, through understanding, because now they both knew this was no longer control, no longer strategy, no longer positioning. This was something real, and real things came with real consequences. The internal battle inside Lena reached its peak after that. Fear still existed, strong, clear, logical, because everything about this world was dangerous. Everything about him was dangerous. But love, or something dangerously close to it, was stronger, not louder, not clearer, but deeper, because it wasn't based on safety. It was based on choice. And she had already made it. That realization settled in her mind with finality. She was not staying because she had no way out. She was staying because she didn't want to leave. And that was the most dangerous position she could be in. The stakes rose quickly after that, because enemies did not stop after one attempt. They escalated, adapted, retried, and this time they came harder, stronger, closer. The final confrontation approached faster than expected, not planned, not scheduled, inevitable, because when pressure reached a certain point, it did not hold. It broke, and when it broke, everything came down with it. The attack came at nightfall's edge, not dark, not hidden, visible, direct, unavoidable. This wasn't a test. This was war. Adrian moved immediately, commanding, controlled, unshaken. But Lena did not stay back. She moved with him, not as someone protected, as someone involved, because the line between them no longer existed. The chaos that followed was intense, fast, relentless. Everything collided at once. Movement, impact, decision, survival. And in the middle of it, one moment changed everything. A miscalculation, a shift, a second too late. And suddenly, Adrian was exposed, just for a moment. But in a world like this, a moment was enough. Lena saw it before he did, before anyone did. And in that instant, she made the only decision she could. She moved, fast, direct, without thinking, without hesitation, toward the danger, toward him, toward the outcome she could not accept. The world slowed. Everything narrowed. The threat, the distance, the choice. And then, impact. The sound cut through everything. Sharp, final, unavoidable. Lena's vision blurred for a second, not from pain, from realization, because something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. Adrian turned, too late, and in that moment, everything changed, because the one thing he had been trying to protect had just stepped into the line of fire. The chaos froze around them, not literally, but emotionally, because this moment was different. This moment was loss. And as Lena felt the weight of what had just happened, one final realization hit her with undeniable force. Love did not make this world safer. It made it more dangerous. And as the sound of the attack echoed through the collapsing moment, one truth became impossible to ignore. This time, she might not be the one who survives. And everything was about to be lost. The moment did not end with the sound of the gunshot. It stretched, twisted, became something heavier than time itself. Lena Carter did not feel pain immediately. What she felt first was silence, a deep, unnatural silence that cut through the chaos, through the movement, through the violence that had filled the air seconds before. Because in moments like this, the world did not stop. It simply lost meaning. Her body reacted before her mind did, a slight shift, a stagger that barely registered. And then, impact, not sharp, not explosive, but heavy, like something had been taken from her. Without permission, Adrian Volkov saw it before anyone else, because his attention had never left her, not even in the middle of war. And the moment he understood what had happened, everything inside him changed. Not slowly, not subtly, completely. The control that defined him, the precision, the calculation, the discipline, collapsed, not outwardly, not in a way others could fully understand, but internally, it shattered, because the one thing he had built his entire life to prevent, loss, was happening again. And this time, he had allowed it. Lena's knees weakened, her body losing balance as reality finally caught up with her. Adrian moved instantly, closing the distance before she could fall completely, catching her with a force that was far from gentle, but absolute in intention. He did not let her hit the ground. He did not let her slip away. Not again, not like before. The chaos around them continued, but it no longer mattered, because the war, the enemies, the outcome, all of it became irrelevant in that single moment. There was only her and the possibility of losing her. That possibility was something Adrian Volkov could not accept, would not accept. His orders came without hesitation, fast, precise, final, and for the first time, they were not about control. They were about survival. Hers. The remaining threat was eliminated quickly, not strategically, not carefully, but decisively, because when a man like Adrian Volkov lost control, there were no limits left, only results. The aftermath was not loud. It was controlled. But beneath that control, everything had changed. Lena drifted in and out of awareness, her senses fading and returning in fragments. Light, movement, pressure, and one constant, him. His presence did not leave, not even for a second, because stepping away was not an option. Time passed. Minutes, hours, unclear, unmeasured, because moments like this did not follow structure. They followed consequence. The outcome did not come immediately, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous part, because uncertainty left space for loss. And loss was something Adrian had spent his entire life learning how to prevent, but control had limits, and this was one of them. The outcome finally arrived, quietly, without announcement, but with weight. Lena survived, not easily, not without cost, but she survived. The relief that followed did not show in Adrian's expression. It never did, but it existed, deep, unspoken, absolute, because survival was not victory. It was continuation, and continuation meant one thing. Everything that led to this moment had consequences. The final confrontation did not happen in a single explosive moment. It unfolded slowly, strategically, because now Adrian was no longer reacting. He was finishing it. The enemies who had pushed too far, who had miscalculated, who had believed his weakness could be exploited, were no longer threats. They were targets. And Adrian Volkov did not leave targets unfinished. One by one, systematically, every connection, every hidden structure, every remaining piece of opposition was removed, not publicly, not dramatically, but completely, because real power did not announce victory. It ensured there was no one left to challenge it. The war ended the same way it began, quietly, but this time, permanently. Lena recovered slowly, not just physically, emotionally, mentally, because survival had changed her. The girl who once stepped into Adrian's world with fear and uncertainty no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood it, not fully, not completely, but enough to know what it meant to stay. enough to understand what it cost. Her relationship with Adrian did not return to what it had been, because moments like that did not allow return. They forced evolution. There was no longer distance between them, no uncertainty, no confusion, only clarity. And clarity was not always comforting, because now Lena understood something she had only felt before. Adrian did not just care about her. He needed her, not in a weak way, not in a dependent way, but in a way that removed control. And for a man like him, that was the most dangerous thing possible. The emotional transformation between them was undeniable. Not softer, not lighter, deeper, more intense. Because everything between them had been tested. By fear, by loss, by reality. And what remained was real. But reality came with consequences. Because love in a world like theirs was never free. It demanded something in return. Always. Lena began to see those consequences clearly. The restrictions that never fully disappeared. The constant awareness of danger. The understanding that peace was temporary. Because the life Adrian lived did not allow permanence. She faced a choice. Not once, but repeatedly. Stay or leave. Both carried risk. Both carried loss. Leaving meant freedom, but also exposure. Because once inside a world like this, you did not simply walk away. You became part of it, a variable, a liability. Staying meant safety, but at a cost, control, influence, a life that was no longer entirely her own. And yet, the choice did not feel equal, because somewhere along the way, she had already chosen. The final twist did not come from an enemy. It came from truth, the kind of truth that did not destroy, but redefined everything. Lena discovered it by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all. A piece of information, a detail that did not align, a timeline that felt slightly off. And once she noticed it, she could not ignore it, because patterns always led somewhere. She followed it quietly, carefully, until it revealed something she had never considered. Adrian Volkov had known about her before she ever entered his world. Not recently, not partially, completely. Her background, her situation, her struggles, all of it he had known. And yet, he allowed her to enter, allowed her to stay, allowed everything that followed. That truth shifted everything, because it meant this was never coincidence, never chance, never random. It was a decision, his decision. The realization settled slowly, but heavily, because it raised one question she could not ignore. Why? Why her? Not as a moment, not as an outcome, as a beginning. Because if he knew, then everything that followed had been shaped by that knowledge. Lena confronted the truth internally before she ever faced him, because she needed to understand it, not emotionally, logically. But logic did not provide a clear answer, only possibility. And possibility was more dangerous than certainty. When she finally looked at him, really looked at him, she saw it, not in his actions, not in his words, but in something deeper, something that had always been there. He had not lost control because of the jacket, or the attack, or the situation. He had lost control because of her, because she was the one variable he could not predict, could not control, could not remove, and that changed everything. The emotional hook became undeniable. The most dangerous truth wasn't that she belonged to his world. It was that his world had changed because of her. Lena stood in front of him, her thoughts clear, her understanding complete, because now there was no illusion left, no confusion, only truth. She had a choice, stay or leave. But this time, it wasn't about fear. It was about consequence. And she understood those consequences fully, because loving a man like Adrian Volkov was not a decision. It was a commitment to risk, to danger, to a life that would never be simple. She did not walk away, because leaving would not erase what existed. It would only change its form. And some connections did not disappear. They remained permanent. She stayed, not as someone trapped, not as someone controlled, but as someone who understood and accepted the cost. The relationship did not become easier. It became real, and real things carried weight. The story did not end with resolution, because lives like theirs did not end cleanly. They continued with new risks, new challenges, new consequences. But one truth remained, unchanged, unavoidable, final. As Lena looked at Adrian one last time, not with fear, not with doubt, but with clarity, she realized something that had been hidden from her all along. She was never just part of his world. She had always been the reason he lost control. And that truth was only the beginning of what would come next.